I just wanted to sort of start off with a few caveats just to ground us in maybe a different mindset. So first is just as a lead up to what we're about to hear about. I've been a clinician for more than 2 decades. I've studied brains in a lab for 17 years, and I just wanted to say to start off that I both believe and don't believe what I'm about to tell you. And I think in part that's because, with research is based in a world of averages. And my experience has been that there are no average people out there. So that's just the first thing to ask you to contemplate. The second thing is that I have a sort of controversial opinion about the way in which we articulate truth, in that I often feel that everything and its opposite is also true. So you'll hear me say some declarative things, but please know, because I don't want to launch into a philosophical mode entirely, that probably somewhere inside of me, I'm also thinking that the opposite is true. So the reason I'm saying that to you is that I want you to sort of recognize that today I'm going to start out, I was thinking about this and I was thinking, as a speaker, one of the things you want to do is you want to inspire audiences, each person in the audience really, to find a part of themselves that they feel very connected to, and you want them to find a place where they can make transitions. And in general, one of the ways to do that is to do that in a very sort of optimistic and high energy way. And I do feel very optimistic about the world, as you'll hear from a lot of my examples. But at the same time, I felt obliged to take a little bit of a risk and to ask you to please join me in some questions today. To a certain extent, the first part of my presentation is going to be mostly about asking you to join me in the uncertainty of what we're doing. Because I feel that if we just go on sort of talking about this is what is, and this is what I do, and this is why I'm so great, that actually we're not going to be making any changes in the world. And I feel that as a group, we have a tremendous opportunity to come together as a community and to really address my fundamental hypothesis, which is that I think part of the reason we have some of the limits that we have in the outcomes that we have is that we haven't really found a way to truly collaborate, to truly build community. And so I want to invite you to just 2 possibilities in general. One, for us to continue the thought process of yesterday, of asking, are there smaller communities within Fred, or Fred entirely, that I want to be part of so that I can address some of these questions? Or do I just want to be part of the ripple effect of what happens here? And I think that, I think we deeply respect that some people will want to get really involved and other people will not. In fact, when Michelle asked me yesterday, well, do you want to be part of Fred? I was like, but who wouldn't want to be part of Fred? I mean, it's sort of, and if not only because of the amount of love and the intellectual power in this room, at the same time, you'll see from some of the questions that I want to ask you to consider that I believe that we are at a time of immense crisis in leadership. And I think, being the high energy individuals that we are and the optimistic individuals that we are, and given that, we all have sort of productive jobs and we get called upon to do different things, it's hard to notice these things. So I'm going to mention them just so that you can think a little bit more deeply about, well, what does this actually mean? Because I often ask myself, it's sort of, that Gallup has done engagement surveys globally for the last few years, and global engagement is currently at 13%. That means that close to 9 out of 10 people in the world are not engaged in their work. In the UK, it's 6%. So if you think about this, it's a pretty important statistic, because I often think, my workshops get really good ratings, people get really happy, they invite me back to work, and everyone that I know has the same experience. And I'm sure a lot of you have that experience. Then how is this happening? What is lost in translation between the work that we're doing and the fact that the workforce is not engaged? So that's the first question I want you to be asking yourself. Like, is there something that we could be doing differently? And certainly for myself, there's a part of me that's like, well, I've already got my shtick going, I'm going to do what I do. But there is another part of me that says, I don't really want to die feeling like I want to look at that statistic again and feel like I haven't actually tried to make some small dent in it. And the one thing that I am fairly convinced of is that I stand the biggest chance of doing that with other people and not alone. And that's in part because there is a collective intelligence factor that's actually been found mathematically that is higher and can be higher than the maximum intelligence in the group, and it can be higher than the average intelligence in the group. So something happens where 1 + 1 equals 250,000. And I think that's the leverage point that I'd like us to consider here at Fred. The second is that burnout is an all-time high. And I can tell you, I have a program on burnout, and every time I approach anyone about it, they're like, oh, we can't use the word burnout. We want people to feel empowered. We want them to feel resilient. And the more people seem to think that that is the solution, the worse this gets. So if you think about physician burnout, for example, physician burnout is above 50% right now. So you have a 1 in 2 chance of getting more than 1 in 2 chance of getting a burnt out emergency room doc or surgeon. So think about the implications of that. If we ignore this, and if we just keep on trying to only make it positive, we're not going to really try to find solutions. And then the third thing is that suicide is at an epidemic level. And when I thought about presenting this particular fact, I thought, well, maybe people will say, well, that's not my field, it's everybody else's field. Except that we are supposed to be developing leaders. Right? We're supposed to be developing leaders in corporations who care about not just leadership, but life. And I don't believe in the boundaries between psychiatry and executive coaching. I don't believe that because I'm a brain scientist, only I should talk about the brain, any more than I believe that you should not work out because you're not a specialist in physical exercise. I think we all need to get involved in this conversation, and we're part of this conversation. Because if you look at the suicide statistics, they're kind of startling, especially as we think about the next-gen committees. It is the second leading cause of death in 15 to 29-year-olds. That's kind of a remarkable fact. There are record-breaking highs in high-income countries. In fact, in the UK, it rose by more than 50% between 2007 and 2016. And in the US, the number of suicides is double the number of homicides, most of them due to firearms. So again, let that sink in, because we talk a lot about homicides, we talk a lot about the fact that we know what's happening outside of us, but I feel to a large extent, as people who are interested in developing leaders, we really need to be thinking about those 15-year-olds as well. And then an alarming 78% of suicides occur in middle to low income countries. And we were just talking about this morning, but I think because a lot of us work in places where people don't report depression or don't report suicide, we're like, well, it's not around me. But if you look at recent studies that have been done in the UK and in the US and in South Africa, actually, in South Africa, 1 in 4 people meets clinical criteria for depression. And this has huge consequences for organizations. From a presenteeism perspective, showing up at work and really not doing anything, the US has the highest level of presenteeism in the world. Japan has the highest level of absenteeism, both due to depression. So I think that sometimes when we segregate ourselves into these different categories, we forget that if I'm talking to an audience and 1 in 4 people is depressed and 9 out of 10 people are not engaged, then how can I actually be doing anything with any audience? And so if we ignore that, we can do one of two things. We can either say, maybe I can work with the employee assistance program and try to increase screening within the organization. Maybe I can think about how to integrate things across disciplines. I actually recently just contacted somebody on LinkedIn because I saw that she was an artist who decided that she wanted to participate in medicine. And so she's been going full steam ahead. She's meeting with doctors. She wants to actually change healthcare. And I really loved that she didn't feel like she had to be restricted to art because somebody gave her the title artist. So I'm going to talk to her on Monday, and we're going to think together about how we can break some of these boundaries. And so I'm inviting you to think about how we can break some of these boundaries as well. And that's the dark side of what I'm sharing with you. I think the bright side is that this is an age of opportunity, right? Think about that. If engagement's at 13%, if in our lifetimes we can change it to 20, that'd be cool. If we can just make a dent in the suicide rates by thinking a little bit more deeply about what's creating all this hopelessness. You know, we've heard about hopelessness as an epidemic in this country. I think Bob Johansen talked about it and talked about the fact that we're living in a place, at a time where a lot of young people feel hopeless. And hopelessness is an epidemic. You know, the impact of loneliness on longevity is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So lonely people are as likely to die prematurely as someone who is smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So let's think together about what this opportunity is. And I guess the one thing I would like you to leave today with is, if there's one thing I could change in my practice, what would that be? If there's one thing I could change in my practice, what would that be? So when we think about transforming leaders through the lens of brain science, I know when I first started doing this, people would say things like, oh, what does neuroscience have to do with anything? And I would be like, well, you know, businesses are made up of people, and people have brains, so if we understand the brain, maybe we'll understand people, it'll impact the business. And they're like, oh, but that sounds so theoretical. I said, the brain sounds theoretical? Like, it's kind of a reality in your head. And it's like, it does stuff. Oh, but that's not my field. Really? Like, you think you're speaking to someone and the brain is not involved? Like, it's very involved. So I think one of the things I like to do is to, and I'm also not somebody who believes, like, you know, that science is that, or that neuroscience should exist on its own. I really believe that it needs to be integrated and applied within organizations. And so if you ask, well, does neuroscience add anything new? I think we all know, if you look at statistics around the number of people who succeed with business plans, it's not a very high level of people. You look at just entrepreneurial failure rates, even with business plans, it's pretty high. So I think the hypothesis here is that mindset matters. And I think the data that backs this up is, I think, related to a comment that John Carter made. And yesterday we talked about things, and I think when Mindy Grossman was talking, she stressed the importance of culture over strategy and said strategy is important, but we really need to also think a little bit about culture. And I'm going to now sort of present you with this challenge from John Carter, which is that the central issue, excuse me, is never strategy, structure, culture, or systems. The core of the matter is changing the behavior of people. And that actually the highest leverage point, by 4 times according to Keller and Price, for managerial efficacy is actually mindset. So part of what I'm presenting to you is the idea that mindset matters, that it matters to understand how we can change it, and that it matters to understand how we can provide these frameworks, and again, I would suggest through the lens of the way in which you currently work, and not how I work or how anybody else works. So when we think about mindset, that's the psychological medium in which these shifts can occur, and the brain is really the physiological construct. So the hypothesis here is that a new mindset will lead to new results. And here are the caveats again. I really, when I present, I have 75 30-page PDFs on 3 and 5-step processes. So when people say, you know, how do you work in this philosophical way with leaders? I'm like, well, you know, if I know that somebody's overly concrete, I will lead them to their subjectivity through a series of concrete conversations. Like, yes, it's practical. These are the 5 steps. These are the 3 steps. These are the 2 steps. And then they love it. And they're like, that's great. We like things that are practical. I'm thinking this is not going to shift anything, but that's okay. So, like, you know, like, it's like by telling you need to have a plan and write down a strategy. It's like, you know, people know that already. That's really not where the X factor is. So I include this really as a conversational framework. I also think that it's much richer. Neuroscience in isolation, I hear of a lot of neuroscience being done as sort of like the reason why you should not be doing performance management, or the reason why you should believe me. You know, human science is not that certain. I mean, it's not like mathematics. There's a lot in science that is hugely subjective. Then, you know, as I said, 13% of people are engaged, so neuroscience is not going to solve this problem on its own. In fact, it can make people feel less engaged when they're like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about, like, what's this brain thing? You know, I do believe that the next step in the way we're collecting data needs to be about personalization. I think we need to think about an individual and use artificial intelligence to that end. And I think yesterday that was what Mindy Grossman was sort of pointing to, that in terms of wellness, we want to understand within the context of each person, how does their genetics, how does their mindset, how does their attitude actually impact them. And I do believe also that there's a difference between action and deep action. People are always saying things to me like, we want things that are actionable. And I'm like, well, there's all kinds of action. Action is not a homogeneous construct. I could ask you all right now to perform an action. Like yesterday, I think some people, when we were trying to get to the action part of what to do with the analogies, I think some people would be like, well, how can I why should I come up with an action? I'm just like enjoying thinking about it. And there's probably a wisdom behind that. And the wisdom behind that is that the action does need to be a deeper action. And in my opinion, deep action is actually something that involves motivation, commitment, it involves enthusiasm, being responsive, inspired, embodied, and transcendent. So the next time you recommend an action, I'm going to ask you, can you consider whether that action has all of those things in it? Because that kind of action is much more likely to be successful, in my opinion again, than an action that's just something. Somebody who has to do a process, like just put a screw in something, probably doesn't need all of those things. But at the same time, to maintain that job, to be interested in that job, to actually maintain the culture of enthusiasm in the company, just doing actions doesn't get anybody anywhere. Now the problem is that we we tend to be very distorted in our thinking, in general. The world gave, Daniel Kahneman got a Nobel Prize for showing that we are incapable of being rational. He got a Nobel Prize. They were like, this guy needs a Nobel Prize. He found the truth. We are incapable of being rational. And every time I go into an organization, they're like, I want something actionable. I want something rational. It's like, that's not possible. I can give you a framework, but there's a lot of data that we don't have that we actually need to be thinking about. So today I'm going to walk you through just 3 concepts. One's going to be a high-level concept that hopefully will influence the way in which you design programs. And then I'm going to show you 2 very concrete strategies that I use when I feel compelled to be practical. So the idea is, how can brain science help you redesign the programs that you're delivering? And from my point of view, the way I use the brain science is really much more as an anchor. So I believe that the power of humanity lies in the subjectivity of being human. And there are lots of objective processes that research can show us. But it's very hard to actually engage your full humanity. It's a little dizzying. Kierkegaard said that anxiety was the dizziness of freedom. We all say we want freedom, but when we get it, it feels like we don't have any gravity. So we're like, let me build more balls and chains into my life. I can't do that. See why I can't do that? So we find reasons not to have this freedom. And so I feel like what neuroscience, in my opinion, the most helpful thing from neuroscience is to give people anchors so that they can enter the subjective process of what it means to be a leader and what it means to be alive. So if we're talking about the art and the science of leadership, I think the first thing is to come up with a working definition of leadership, right? And there are like a gazillion. Of the many that I've seen, probably the one that impresses me most is that by is the definition by Warren Bennis. And Warren Bennis said that becoming a leader is synonymous with becoming yourself. It's precisely that simple and also that difficult. And it's a pretty profound conclusion and simple conclusion for someone who's been studying this his entire life and researching this his entire life. It's like, all you have to do is be yourself. And I think we all know that to a certain extent it's okay to be yourself, but it's also really difficult to be yourself. And what is the self anyway? Now again, I would not enter a corporation with this as my pitch. I'd be thinking it and thinking, okay, so let me just figure out we'll go through all the practicalities first. And my experience has been that there's no CEO, I've worked with lots of very high-level CEOs, there's no CEO who doesn't want to go there, right? It usually ends up being a very deep contemplation about what they're actually doing with their lives. So I'm going to offer you 5 things about the self that may be counterintuitive and that may actually impact the way in which you design programs. The first is anatomical. right? So if I ask you, like, what are you? You'd say, I'm human. Well, what's a human? A human is half human cells and half bacterial cells, which is sort of already like a little bit off-putting, right? It's like, what? Also, more than 50% of us, closer to 60% is water. And every human cell is powered by a mitochondrion, which is thought to be a derivative of a bacterium. So we are basically bags of water and bacteria and a couple of human cells thrown in for good measure. So this is what the self is. And if we're trying to understand, I mean, it's disturbing. It's like, what? I'm like mostly bacteria? Like, but I took a shower this morning. What? It's like, well, actually, there's nothing you can do about it. Most of it's in your colon. There's a bunch in your skin. But more 50% of the cells that constitute who you are is bacteria. So it's like, well, what is a leader then? A leader is, my job is to lead a bag of water, bacteria, and human cells. Like, what? So how do I actually do this? Like, how does this affect my design? Well, the first thing is that it takes us to a pretty sort of crazy place where we realize, maybe we have a clue to the fact that there's something about physical perception that's a little odd. Maybe what you see is not what you get. Maybe there's some biological basis for this illusion that we call the body. Then we say, the next thing, I sent a topic, like, what was this, 2 years ago, to Harvard Business Review as a submission for a blog, and I said, I just wanted to talk about why leaders need to take care of their guts, and she was like, no. Like, like, not interested, like, we love you, but no. Like, the world is not ready for this gut thing. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, well, what does that have to do with leadership? I don't know, the same thing it had to do with the zygote. Like, we all came from one cell, and then that cell divided into a number of cells, and then the head went to the head, and the tail end went to the tail end, but everything came from one cell. Your gut and your brain, they were connected from the beginning. Just because they're in different parts doesn't mean they're not connected. So the idea of understanding the gut-brain axis is that recent evidence has shown that gut bacteria can actually change moods. By changing your gut bacteria, by using probiotics, for example, you can decrease depression. So we're saying depression is increasingly epidemic in corporations. So why wouldn't we actually consult a nutritionist? Like, nutrition doesn't particularly interest me as a subject, but I don't actually consult or call on nutritionists when, in fact, maybe I should. And more, I'm noticing, especially with healthcare companies, they are interested in this. They're interested in all kinds of things. The last workshop I did, which was very positively received, in the middle of talking, everybody got up and started walking around the room. And they were like, no, don't be alarmed. We don't believe in sitting, because sitting is like smoking and will kill you. So So they just did a lot of the workshop just walking around. So people are becoming aware of nutrition, they're becoming aware of walking, they're becoming aware of the fact that we need to behave differently. So the first design element I'm going to ask you about is, do you want to consult a nutritionist? Do you want somebody to be thinking about this gut-brain connection? And if not, why not? And there are lots of reasons why to and why not. The second construct about the self, which I think we take for granted, is that we generally, if I ask you, like, what is the self, we tend to think of ourselves as distinct, right? Like, we're different. We are separate from everyone else because there appears to be a space between you and me. The problem is, whether you care about other people or not, and whether you love other people, and whether you want to be empathic or not, you've got a brain in your skull, and you've got holes in your head. So you're just connected whether you like it or not. And there's a lot of evidence to show that we are connected to our environments. And so inside every one of you is Chicago, that boat trip we went on. It's in your brain because it entered your eye and it's stored in your visual cortex, and it's going to be coded as memory. It's going to be changing your brain tissue. Every experience you choose to have gets incorporated into your brain tissue. Every person you choose to have in your life gets incorporated into your brain tissue. When I move my hands like this, what happens in your brain is your mirror neurons activate so that it starts to imitate me automatically. Those of you who play sport or watch sport know that feeling of how you feel sort of jazzed up at the end of it, where you want to go out and play when you watch someone playing, because your brain is believing that you're doing it. It just does it at a sub-threshold level. It also does this for intentions, and it does it for emotions. So that's the reason when you're around people who bum you out, they just bum you out, even though you're feeling like you're in a good mood. You know, you see this amongst couples all the time. Like, I was in a great mood. I came home with such a sour face. I don't know what to do with this. And then they're like, I hate you. What they actually mean is, I hate the you that entered my mirror neurons in my head. And so I sometimes teach people mirror neuron obstruction strategies, because you know, there's a lot you can do with that. But I think that the idea that our worlds outside of us, the fact that everything outside you inhabits living tissue, is kind of a remarkable thing. And there's an opportunity here to actually design learning very differently. The implications here are that leaders are a composite of themselves and others and the environment. So whether someone's calling you to address teams or not, it doesn't matter. Even if you're working with an individual, the team is in their heads. And if they don't understand that the team is coded in their heads, everybody needs to understand, every time you do something negative to someone, their expression goes into your brain. So if you want that in your brain, then do it. It's not the most pleasant thing to have, and I think that when we're thinking about designing learning, we want to, even for an individual, if you were going to, let's say you had a coaching engagement and you were thinking with somebody, well, I'm going to work for 9 months with them, think about how you want to incorporate the environment and the other and the self. It's a decent way to actually break that up. Otherwise, you're just going to be talking about the self as if the self is separate from others. And one question I like to ask leaders when I'm working with them is, who would you like to be in someone else's head? Do you want to be like the screaming person, the person who's like this negative person? Like when you meet your team and they meet you, who do you want to be in their heads when they go home? And so I think there's a real opportunity here to actually think not just about the anatomy and the illusion of that and the fact that we need to care about nutrition, but also that we need to care about the fact that the individual is not really as separate as we think that individual is. And a very practical example of someone who addresses this in corporate engagements is someone named Eitan Shapira, who's both popular and unpopular at MIT because he's a great artist and he also makes a lot of money from corporate gigs. And so, you know, that's the kind of thing academics look down upon, that kind of thing. So the idea of linking business, art, and social enterprise is important. What Eitan does is he's a sculptor. So, you know, like the experience that I had the other day when we went to Radio Flyer and I was just literally just like blown off my feet. I was like, what is this form? It's like entering my head and changing my life. Eitan introduces people to a state of place and being through sculpture. And if you look him up, you'll see there are tremendous results that he actually gets by provoking people to discover themselves, because people don't really need to be told what to do. But we often don't have the time and we don't have the presence of mind to know who we are. And so when you introduce an environmental provocateur in that way, you're asking someone like, you know, like when I went to Radio Fly, I was like, I don't even know why I'm responding like this. Like, what is this? You know, some kind of hidden nostalgia, something about the impact of form on consciousness. And if you look this up, you'll see there's a lot of evidence to show that architecture impacts consciousness. Now, having said those two things, you know, if I did enter a corporate engagement like that, which I do not, you know, most people would say, tell me something practical. You know, and then my response to that would be, guess what? That's like not how the brain works. That actually, as practicality is an extraction from the melange of information that is in our brains that we call being human. Right? It's just an extrapolation. It's a structure. It's an architectural form that comes from the cement and this whole raw earth of what we are. And so just to make this point a little bit more concretely, I thought I'd show you this video so that you can begin to ask yourself, how do I deal with the fact that more than 90%, some people would say close to 99% of what's happening in my head is unconscious. It's one of the reasons it's very hard to listen to great leaders tell you about why they're successful. Because what they will do is they'll tell you all the conscious reasons that they think they're successful. But it's very hard for them to actually share the nuances in the unconscious. So take a look at this video and see what you think of it.
Okay, time to move on. Now, here is a question. If you had to go with, do you think you're on? Because the recent research seems to suggest that we're incredibly prone to the power of suggestion. We just can't help ourselves. Anyway, we set up an experiment to put that to the test. So I'm a pretty decisive person. I make my own decisions. I understand the reasons why I make the choices I do. Or do I? I mean, does anyone? I want to see if we can change the way people act without them realising they're being manipulated. We've asked members of the public to take part in a series of tests which are being run for us by psychologist Peter Nash.
So, nothing nasty to do, so hopefully you'll be happy to stay right the way through.
The participants are given a one-handed counting task.
Ready, steady, go.
They're told we're looking at left and right-handedness, but this is just a front. A second group of similar volunteers do the same test, but instead of boring old bits of paper,
This is where we get you to count a pretty large pile of money.
they get to count real banknotes. This is the only difference between the two groups. Let's see if that small difference can affect their behavior.
Now, we're going to give you some sweets.
We've asked both groups to compare two bowls of sweets.
What we want you to do is say which you find the most chocolatey, the most crunchy, and so on.
Given 10 minutes to make their decisions, something rather interesting emerges. On the left, those who counted paper only eat enough to answer the questions. But the people who counted money just kept on eating. Amazingly, the group that handled the money ate 50% more of the sweets. It seems money can make you hungry. This effect is called priming, influencing a specific behavior without the person being aware of it. But how can money have an effect on hunger? Well, money seems to trigger an innate desire. In many ways, having money is the same as having resources. And back in the dim and distant past, resources meant food. Money and food are linked by the same basic urge to survive. You could argue that it's not that hard to change someone's hunger level. But my psychologist friend Peter tells me we can also change how people treat each other, again without them realising they're being manipulated. I have to see this. First, we reinforce the priming. Both groups get an identical word task, except that for one group, the words are related to money and wealth. Then, we simply film them and watch their behaviour. As my friend struggles with a pile of papers, some of our volunteers stop to help her, but not everyone feels the need to help. Guess what? Those who handle the money are more likely to become warm. Oh, wow, that's really bad. It's not that they're simply being unhelpful. Psychologists have studied this and found all kinds of subtleties. It just seems that money makes you more self-reliant. And self-reliant people expect other people to be self-reliant too.
And the video then just goes on to show like a number of different ways in which just handling the money can changes your physical capacity to handle coldness. Like people can keep their hands in water twice as long. And so it's a real dilemma, right? I always find it perplexing, and it's a difficult question to answer, which is if more than 90% of what we do is unconscious, why do organizations spend close to 100% of their budget on conscious interventions? And is there a way that we can be more mindful about what's going on in the unconscious? Now, my suspicion is that, from having talked to you, is that a lot of you get into the unconscious really quickly. Right? And a lot of you get into the unconscious because of the way you operate and the way you are. And I'm just emphasizing that is the most important thing. Even if you're scaling your work through technology, the idea of thinking about the unconscious is particularly important. Now, here's some things I'd like to just sort of present you with in terms of thinking about it. The first is about grit. Right? So if you look at Angela Duckworth's work on grit, grit is very highly correlated with success according to her. And at some level, you would understand that because, being a successful person, if you persevere and you just keep doing something over and over again, you'll probably be successful. Well, Marcus Creedy found in 2017 that grit has very weak correlations with success in a sample of 66,000 people. His conclusion was that there are a bunch of people who persevere and don't make it. So when you ask successful people why they're successful, they choose their conscious reasons. They're like, because I just really persevered. But there are a lot of people who try very hard and never get anywhere. So that's something to think about, because if you're recommending grit, then you're saying just persevere. It seems like that on its own is not enough. Then we heard, I think along the way, we heard many people say, well, the way to get to the goal is to practice, right? I think Malcolm Gladwell popularized this idea that 10,000 hours of work will get you to your expert level. Well, Brooke McNamara at Princeton decided to check on that, and she found that actually, if you look at the success pie, deliberate practice accounts for less than 1% of the success pie for successful people. Doing something over and over again, unsurprisingly, is probably more boring than it is helpful. So the question is, but we all know that we got better at what we were doing because we practiced it, right? Apparently. And it probably is true, but there's still a missing ingredient where doing something over and over again has to happen on some other substrate for it to occur. Like if you look at top tennis players, they all practice really hard. Deliberate practice doesn't make that much of a difference there as well. So again, as I said, I think everything that I'm saying and its opposite is also true. But I want to introduce you to this because we're so used to saying, oh, just practice it and you'll get better at it. And if you look at the statistics, she tested this again for jobs, she tested for education, deliberate practice, success by 4%. Yet I would swear by the fact that it was because I studied my stuff and I went over it again and I practiced it that I got better at it. So at the very least, I want this to provoke questions for you. The third thing came up yesterday. I think when Wendy Grossman was talking about things, she was talking about habits, right? That habits, changing our habits will get us somewhere. I think it's a great idea. I just don't think it's the way the brain works. So 97% of diets fail. Most people regain the weight within 3 years. And actually, if you look at extinction learning, like I've done this myself, where I take people who have airplane phobias, and I first talk to them about airplanes, and then I show them airplanes, and then I go on an airplane with them somewhere, and they come back and they've lost their phobia. Just one exposure to the initial context will bring the phobia right back. It's like being on a diet and being successful and seeing your favorite cookie, right? So I'm not saying that it doesn't work at all. I think if you are able to be successful, I think we all have examples in our lives where we've set up new habits that have protected us. But I am saying it's not as simple as just change your habit, because it's actually quite difficult to change your habits. And then the last thing is about tiny habits. B.J. Fogg, again, a lot of people have been saying, one step at a time. Well, John Locke, who did the original research on goals, had the astounding finding that humans are not actually inspired by mediocrity. That actually, we don't like tiny steps. And if you're working with an impatient CEO who needs to make goals, and you say, don't worry, we'll take tiny steps towards your goals, they're not interested in that. So I think that in certain instances, it appears that habits and tiny steps and grit and repetition do not work. At the very least, we can say that they work and do not work. Because there's a body of research showing that it works, and there's a body of research in meta-analysis showing that it actually doesn't work. So what do we do with this information? What I suggest you do with this information is sort of register this and ask yourself, and the last section of today will be one way of training the unconscious, is how do I incorporate programs to train the unconscious in my design? How do I provoke the unconscious? Like those quests we went on, that was not just a conscious quest. There was a lot of unconscious stuff going on. Pretty much everything designed into this event had strong unconscious sort of pieces to it. Being on the water, being on a boat, listening to music. I was wondering, after listening to that improvisation, I was like, I can't even imagine what's going on in my brain right now. It was so beautiful. And I was like, how improvisational do I want my brain to be? And I think the last thing is to design for motivation. So I'm very interested in this idea of motivation because I think that we've been talking a lot about purpose. We've been talking a lot about what turns people on. And I have a suggestion for you to consider, which is that finding your I is more important than finding your why. That if you are not self-connected, it's very hard to say, that's my purpose, just to name it. Often, purpose is most resonant and authentic when it emerges. And it's not really something that can last, in my opinion. When people say things like, I just want to give back and that kind of thing and provide service and things like that, it's not, for a large majority of people, it just sounds like it's marketing. So I think I want you to think more deeply about, have you, for the rest of your life, what else could you do to enhance your self-exploration so that you can actually help people design for motivation? And I have a lot to say about motivation, so this talk is not about motivation, but I think things like sublimity, for example. If you look at beauty and sublimity, beauty is like when it activates the brain's reward center. Sublimity is something that sweeps you off your feet. How many of your programs are sublime? Like when you go in, like that experience at Radio Flyer, where you go in and you're like, oh my God, I don't even know what's going on here. So much congruity, so much synchrony, it's sweeping me off my feet. So again, I'll ask you to examine the programs you are currently delivering or designing and ask yourself, have I built at least one or two elements of sublimity into it so that people can be swept off their feet, not just impressed with what I'm doing? The fourth construct is about the self. And we hear a lot about mindfulness, and I'm a believer. I think the data is pretty strong, that presence is important. But the reality is that as much as we think time is segmented, there is a now in our brains, but there are also memories. Like the weird part is that your past is in your brain now. Like your past is present. And your brain actually has circuits for the future. It's constantly making computations about possibility, about hopes, about plans. So when you're working with a leader, if you're only working with presence and you're not working with possibility, and for me, this is one of the major themes that emerged from this whole conference, that there's a need to really look at possibility, that if we are to provide any sense of hope, that hope actually has a function, and it actually has a physiologic function. It increases dopaminergic stimulation in the brain. It helps people feel more rewarded. It actually changes the way you perceive the world. It decreases activation of pain centers in the brain. So there's a lot of physiology behind hope. Hope is not just some kind of abstraction that doesn't impact your brain. And so the implications here are that, I do an exercise that sometimes where I'll say your hippocampus is where a lot of long-term memories are processed. And in it, we hang up pictures or portraits of ourselves. So what I'd like you to do is recurate the museum of your mind. Figure out which pictures you're going to put at the front and which pictures you're going to take out and what pictures you're going to replace it with. And that helps people concretize or ground it in the fact that there is a science behind it, that we store our memories a particular way. The other thing I do is I actually have a program on possibility. I have a possibility index that I give people to actually measure their sense of possibility. I have a particular vendor of these services who's doing his PhD on possibility right now, and is actually sort of looking at to what extent am I oriented towards something happening. And I wasn't quite sure how to, I was talking with Michelle and Renee about this. They thought it would be, maybe it would add meaning to what I'm saying to give you a sense of my own absurdity, which is that part of how I got to Harvard was through two very serendipitous events. After medical school in South Africa, I was standing at a game reserve. I went to this talk, which was like a really geeky talk on water intoxication and schizophrenia. And I completely fell in love with the presenter. I was like trembling with excitement, sort of thinking, I don't know what to do. I was standing next to him. We're looking at this. I said, I loved your talk. And he was like, oh, thanks very much. That's great. I said, I don't know what this intuition is, but I feel like you could say something that could change my life. Can you say something? And he's like... And he looks at me, he's like, well, what are you interested in? And I said, well, I'm interested in the brain. And at that time, it was not like a thing. So I was like, I'm interested in the brain. I'm interested in moods and the connection between the two. And this was sort of pre-apartheid South Africa. So he was like, well, we have a program. This is in Stellenbosch, which is an Afrikaner university. So it wasn't even my first language. It was my second language. And so he said, well, we have a scholarship that's due tomorrow. It's a Medical Research Council scholarship. We've never given it to a person of color, and we've never given it to anyone in psychiatry. Your chances are really low. But if you can get it to me by tomorrow, I'll walk it over for you. So I said, sure. And in South Africa, there's like a very sort of colonial system about how you approach. You can't just go and use a fax machine. You have to make an appointment 50 days in advance. You have to make sure you get permission and cleared by everybody. So when I went into the room, maybe I was American in my head at the time, but I was like, what are you doing? You can't do that. And so anyway, I faxed the thing over to him, and he walked it over to the committee, and then he called me a few hours later and was like, congratulations and welcome to Stellenbosch, which was kind of a major move for me, because the year before that, I had taken my final exam in psychiatry, and I had an examiner from NYU. And the examiner, I did well in my exam, and he said, I would take you to NYU anytime, but you're the kind of person who should go to Harvard. I didn't really know what Harvard was, so I was like, oh, thank you very much, that's nice. And then when I went to Cape Town for a year, I finished all of my work in the first 3 months, and the rest of the year was like finishing 1 or 2 days of work and then driving to the ocean and having sundowners and meeting my friends. And suddenly it struck me that because I was the only person of color in that program, all my friends were whites who were like, I'm getting the hell out of here. Like, apartheid is ending, I don't know what to do with this. And the Indian people in South Africa were building bigger and bigger walls. So when I would go, people would say things like, oh, come on, nothing's going to happen at home. And amongst my friends, everybody was leaving to London, leaving to Australia. So I thought, maybe I should consider this Harvard thing. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to get there. But there is this entitled thing about South Africans where you say, if you have a problem within 2 minutes, you're like, can I speak to the manager? So I thought, well, why don't I just call like the manager of Harvard? So I thought, I'll call the head of Harvard. So from my dorm room, I went through an exchange and I called the head of Harvard. I called the office an undergraduate. And the undergraduate office was like, head of Harvard what? And I was like, eventually I got through to the medical school and then the Department of Psychiatry. And Joe Coyle at the hospital where I eventually trained picked up the phone. And I said, I'm just standing here in this dorm room in South Africa thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great to be at Harvard? And he told me later, yeah, you and everybody else, I thought you were crazy. But I had to be polite, so I just said, why don't you send me a note and send me your CV and we'll see what we can do. And so I did, and he apparently circulated the CV for a research position. I got called by Jonathan Cole, who was the father of psychopharmacology, a couple of weeks later. I had an interview. A few weeks later, I got a FedEx saying, congratulations, welcome to Harvard. So and thank you. To a certain extent, of course, you've got to do well to get in, but there are a lot of people in the world who do well, who wouldn't be so crazy as to consider that possibility, right? They wouldn't be so crazy as to say, well, let me just call and find out. And I think that there's something about that possibility that we want to teach people about, to think about hope and depression and how to move forward during uncertain times. As I mentioned, aside from being bags of water and bacteria and a couple of human cells, we also are pretty amazing, right? We can love, we can rebel, we can really enjoy and taste food. We have a lot of beautiful subjective elements to who we are. And so when we're training leaders, we want to actually think and remember that we are not automatons, that even though I think there's a good debate to be had about performance management and whether it works and when it doesn't work. It sounds yesterday from Minnie Grossman that she believes in it. I think there's a lot of data to show that it doesn't work. Maybe it works when you're already motivated and when you're not just afraid. And there's data to show that coaching with compassion is superior to coaching for compliance. So if you're just trying to get somebody from one place to another, it's actually not that effective. Compassion is something that can move people. And so we want to be thinking about how we can design for inspired compassion. And so for this segment, really what I would like you to do, if you're leaving with anything about this, I want you to ask yourself, will I design my programs differently? Will I think about the whole body and invite a nutritionist to my team? Will I design for the composite self, the other, and environment? Will I design for the unconscious? Will I design for what's possible? And will I design for inspired compassion? Because these are many elements that are not immediate. It's not the kind of thing we're like, okay, you need to get from here to there. We don't think about these elements. I certainly don't believe it's the only way to do it, but I think if you think about it yourself and think about your own program, at least one or two of these could make a difference in how you are reaching people. So the second construct I'm going to walk you through is sort of a much more concrete construct around supporting the anxious leader. Now, there's a good kind of anxiety which is called eustress, EU stress, and a bad kind of anxiety that's called distress. Sometimes we need to be a little bit anxious to finish stuff and to get stuff done. But when there's too much stress, it can lead to burnout. So what I did when I was when I was studying brains in the lab was we would give people faces like this to look at while they were lying in the scanner. And so between 0 to 10 milliseconds, nothing happens. It's too fast. Between 10 to 30 milliseconds, it's enough for the unconscious. And between 30 to 150 milliseconds, it's enough for the conscious brain to pick it up. So, in this particular picture, I would be behind this person who would be the tech person looking at the scans while the patients were in the scanner, and they'd be looking up at a face like this. And we'd show them fear, fear, normal, 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 fear, fear, normal, fear. And then we'd try to see later on what happened when they saw the fearful face. Did anything change in the brain? And when I'm delivering this to corporations, I would say, I want you to think about conscious fears that you have, because this is probably what's going on in your brain. And we'll talk about some of the conscious fears, like meeting quarterly targets, or feeling like that the growth is too slow, that there are too many changes going on, so they can ground it in something that they actually relate to. And I say, well, what we know is that the anxiety center of the brain activates when you're afraid. It's called the amygdala. There are, in fact, 2 amygdalae in the brain. And this is the guard dog in the human brain, and it activates, and so it's important for you to know that. But maybe it's more important for you to know that if I showed this to you for 10 to 30 milliseconds, most people, in fact, nobody knows that they've seen the fearful face because it's too fast for the conscious brain to pick it up. But if I look at the brain, it actually does activate the unconscious. It activates the amygdala, even if you don't know that you're encountering that fear. So if consciously your heart is not racing and you're not feeling freaked out and you don't have any sort of dizziness or unsteadiness or nausea, even if you don't know that, if there's anxiety lurking around in your unconscious, it can cause amygdala stimulation. And in fact, this is so powerful that even if you are blind, you have cortical blindness, meaning the occipital cortex is actually knocked out at the back of your head. If I show you a picture of a fearful face, it activates the amygdala. And the reason is that the image enters the eye, it gets processed by the amygdala, but it doesn't get seen by the seeing brain. So your brain is freaking out quietly. Now, why do we care about this? We care about this because the anxiety center of the brain is connected to the thinking center of the brain. And a lot of times as leaders often just think that if there's something wrong in someone's thinking, it must be a thinking disorder. Like, I can't focus, they're not paying attention, they're not completing tasks. They don't think to themselves, maybe this person is feeling something that's disrupting what they're thinking. So when you explain this to people, they understand that better. And this video will sort of summarize what the dilemma is.
The amygdala is a pair of small organs in the brain, each about the size of an almond. The amygdala acts like a thermostat, regulating, among other things, our normal baseline anxiety level. As anxiety levels rise in response to stressors such as bereavement, work stress, or money worries, for example, the amygdala's needle is pushed up to the high anxiety center. Under normal circumstances, this needle returns to normal after the event. But when the stress or anxiety you experience is relentless, the needle gets stuck at the high anxiety position. It becomes instinctual. The subconscious mind, which controls all the automatic bodily systems, thinks that this new anxiety level is appropriate and normal, but you know consciously that it is not. It is as if the hard drive of your mind has been reprogrammed with new anxious software. With this new anxiety level come sensations and symptoms of anxiety disorder and maybe panic attacks, phobias, and disturbing thoughts. So in order to reverse these changes, you have to reset the needle of your amygdala back to the normal position.
And that's, I think, a question a lot of us have to ask, right? So, like, how can we reset this needle? Now, you know when you're distressed that your brain, like, when you think about this, it may sound obvious, but when you're anxious, it's not that obvious, because your brain is thinking, you just got something from the IRS, and you have to look at it. Your brain's thinking, I've got to solve it now. I've got all these fear stories. It lasts forever. I've got no control over this. It's a huge problem. And when it's unconscious, you don't feel anxious. So how is a leader going to think about trying to shift the needle on the amygdala if they're not aware of it? Well, the recommendation I have is explore the hypothesis that if you see something wrong in thinking, that there may be anxiety disrupting it. So if you see people who are hitting a wall, right, or if you yourself are hitting a wall, if you feel like you are making mistakes over and over again, if you are slowed down, if you are disorganized, or if you are falling short of your goals, you might try to find a way around that wall, or to try to stop making mistakes, or to try to speed up, all of which are legitimate. But if those things are not working, consider that the problem is not with your thinking. It's that there are earthquakes going on in the amygdala that are creating these aftershocks in the frontal cortex. So no matter what you do to your thinking, if you don't reset the needle on the amygdala, then you're not really going to be able to get your work done. So the technique, this is one of those practical techniques that I teach. It's a 5-step technique based on a ton of research, and meaning like for each of those, there are a bunch of brain imaging studies show that if you do this, the brain will change. It will shift blood from the anxiety center back to the thinking brain. And the mnemonic is CIRCA. And I'll go through what each of those stands for. So the first C is chunking, which is when you get some bad news, the first thing you want to do is say, well, okay, like how am I going to solve this problem today, tomorrow, next week? Again, it sounds obvious now, but a lot of times when you get that news, you feel like you've got to solve it now. So just reminding yourself that you have to chunk that down can redistribute the blood back to the thinking brain. Then there's ignore mental chatter, which is basically mindfulness, right? Which is like closing your eyes, placing your attention on your breath, and ignoring whatever mental chatter there is. And if your attention goes to your mental chatter, you gently bring this back to your breath. There's a lot of data showing that mindfulness will decrease amygdala activation. It can also influence your genes and longevity. So there have been preliminary studies showing that there are telomeres in the edge of your chromosome, which get shorter and shorter as you age, and mindfulness can actually protect those. So it's a worthwhile technique exploring if that's your cup of tea. Then reality check is essentially this too shall pass. So you check in with yourself with like, I'm freaking out about this thing. Like, I had this horrible news. I don't know what to do. Whatever's horrible often passes. And there are ways you can build resilience around that as well. So that's what reality check is for. Control check is basically the serenity prayer. Is there stuff I can control? Is there stuff I can't control? A lot of people will only think about like, I hate climate change, I don't know what's going on with the government, the stock market's crazy. If you're not doing anything about those things, you're occupying attentional units with stuff that you cannot control. So ask yourself quite deliberately, what do I need to let go of so I can release attentional units so I can actually get done what I need to get done? And then the last A is for attention shift, which is basically reminding yourself to think about the solution rather than the problem. Like, we don't want to get stuck in the fact that engagement is 13% and suicide is a problem and depression is a problem. We want to say, okay, let's start thinking about some solutions. Can I do one thing that can shift the needle on that? And people forget that sometimes. You'll hear a lot of negativity and not a lot of solution orientation. So, as I said, with chunking, you break things down. With ignore mental chatter, it's a mindfulness exercise. With reality check, it's this too shall pass. With control check, it's identify what you cannot control and let go of it. And with attention shift, what different questions can you ask? Like, who else can help me? What can they help me do? So the more you shift your attention to the solution, the more you'll be asking questions that can be helpful. So an example of a challenge would be having to reach a financial or productivity target. So someone says to you, I can't reach this target, the economy is tanking, our budgets are shrinking, people are restless and unproductive. The person you're reporting to is calling you at the 1 month mark, sort of at all hours of the day. Your spouse is calling you to dinner. The kids are crying. It's not that unusual, right? But it's kind of weird to think that we call this thing a life. Again, I'll ask you to address this idea that freedom is not, that we have a very ambivalent relationship with freedom. But when this happens, I would like you the next time this happens to say, let me think about CIRCA. Can I chunk this down? Like, I'm in a horrible life circumstance. Let me break down what I know is going to happen now and in the next month and in the month after that. Let me be mindful. This is going to pass. However it happens, it's going to pass. What can I control? I'm going to control these things. This is what I control. What I can control, I can control. And let me figure out how to solve this. So using CIRCA at those points can be really helpful. And in terms of sort of using this technique, it's particularly helpful. I'll walk you through an example from an organization. But before that, with regard to the control part, I thought I'd show you this video because I found it particularly moving, and it was a video of Lady Gaga when she was at a point in her career where she didn't want to sing. She was like, I hate this. And I think we all know that feeling, right? Where we're asking ourselves, like, why am I doing this again? Like, what is this? Like, why did I go talk to people and try to change something and they drag their feet and I'm trying to change it again and I made this my job? Like, why did I make people my job? It's sort of like, that may be why we're so obsessed with technology. We're like, I can control. Like, but I think it's hard to, if you work with people, because people are so random, right? But we're also random. So take a look at this and see what she thought of at the burnout point in her life.
I have had to make decisions like, why am I unhappy? Okay, Stephanie Gaga, hybrid person. Why are you unhappy? Why is it that you wanted to quit music a couple years ago? It's my life. Really don't like selling, fragrances, perfumes. I don't like wasting my time spending days just shaking people's hands and smiling and taking selfies. It feels shallow to my existence. I have a lot more to offer than my image. I don't like being used to make people money. I feel sad when I'm overworked and that I just become a money-making machine and that my passion and my creativity take a back seat. That makes me unhappy. So what did I do? I started to say no. I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. I'm not taking that picture. I'm not going to that event. I'm not standing by that because that's not what I stand for. And slowly but surely I remember who I am. And then you go home and you look in the mirror and you're like, yes, I can go to bed with you every night. Because that person, I know that person. That person has balls. That person has integrity. That person has an opinion. That person doesn't say yes. That person doesn't get a text from somebody and say, oh my God, they wrote this and they said this emoji. Should I write this back? What do you think? Is that okay to say? Are they going to like me if I say that? Should I say something different? This is the age that we live in. We're not actually communicating with each other. We are unconsciously communicating lies.
It's a really powerful reminder for us to be thinking about all the stuff we say yes to, right? And a client example that I used this in a company that was preparing for a new merger, and everybody was freaking out. And so the HR department was like, we need to do something because they're not even being productive right now. And what I did was I walked them through circle, like, what's happening now, what's happening after. We went through a mindfulness thing. Once this is over, and then they were like, oh yeah, actually this will be over. It's not going to last forever. But it feels like torture while the merger is happening, right? What can you control? What can you not control? And how can you work through that? And how can you actually sort of think about solutions right now, just so you can set that up? The merger is going to be happening. It's happening when it's happening. And it really was quite sort of remarkable. And so I, in general, will walk people through an exercise like Circa, and I would recommend that you also sort of just walk them through those 5 steps and ask them and let them know that this changes brain blood flow, and let them know that you can use this as a framework even for a couple of different sessions with an individual client as well. So, when people are being slow or unproductive, one of the take-home points here is consider the fact that anxiety is actually causing this. And because the thinking and feeling brains are connected, use Circa so that you can help them get from one place to another. So I'm going to ask you to go through a mini exercise for 5 minutes. I'd like you to take 2 minutes to think of 2 things you want to say no to, like working relentlessly. I just thought you might relate to something about that. Write these down, and then in the next 3 minutes, just talk to your partner about these. And I know it's a short time, but make a commitment to one thing that you're going to give up when you leave this conference.